All right, we're in 2 Kings chapter 8, verse 7 is where we will pick up here in just a minute. I will give you a fair warning that my brain is not working very well today, and I've got about 25 pages of writing between me and graduation, and they're all due this week. So, anyway, so I've been staring at a computer screen a lot. So anyway, we'll try and make it through this, and I think we should be able to make it through without a problem, but also to keep in mind, we're going to try and review when we get done with this to try and put things in perspective for us and to kind of see the full picture, because it's really easy to get lost in the midst of all this. And so when we finish this chapter, it's the end of a section, the third section in the books, and excuse me, hopefully we'll be able to review that together. So last week we met the Shunammite woman again. You remember her from chapter 4, and she did not have children. God through Elijah gave her a son who died, and then she comes and he raises him from the dead, and because of a famine that's coming upon them, most likely because of Israel's sinfulness, which was one of the covenant curses if you didn't obey God. And so she leaves town at the word of Elisha, and then comes back to have her land, to claim her land, and the king is very gracious with her. And we talked about that in the sense of that just because a person may not be fully righteous doesn't mean that they don't have any good whatsoever inside of them. Doesn't mean that they're incapable of doing good, okay? Because he is extremely gracious here, and he is certainly an idolater in every sense of the imagination, all right? So where we're going to pick up is actually, before we look at this, I want us to go back. Just hold your finger there and go back. Somebody read for us 1 Kings chapter 19 and verse 15. 1 Kings 19 and verse 15, because this was Elijah's struggles in the wilderness, and he's met with God, and now God is going to give him a direction. So somebody read that for us, 1 Kings 19, 15. Okay. Sorry, go ahead. No, it's good. I just heard what I wanted to hear, and I was ready to jump. So, Hazael, king of Damascus, anoint him. Now, that was said to Elijah, but that's not going to happen until basically right here. Hazael is going to become king. Now, Elijah has long since left the scene, right? He's ascended back into heaven. But we're going to meet this person that he was told to anoint, and he's going to become king through sleight of hand, well, through murder, to be honest with you. So let's read back in 2 Kings 8 and verse 7. It says, "Now Elisha came to Damascus. Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, was sick, and when it was told him the man of God had come here, the king said to Hazael, 'Take a present with you and go and meet the man of God, and inquire of the Lord through him, saying, Shall I recover from this sickness?'" So Elisha goes to Damascus. Now, this is the first time in either of these books that one of the prophets has set foot on foreign soil. Having some technical difficulty. Anyway, the first time he set foot on foreign soil. Damascus is the capital of Syria, okay? It is, to my knowledge, still the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. It's still there today. The street called Straight, where Ananias and Saul of Tarsus were when he was converted, is still there. And so the capital of Syria, he goes there, and then you've got Ben-Hadad. Now, we met Ben-Hadad in the previous chapters, especially in chapter 6, right? What kind of interaction did he have with Ben-Hadad in chapter 6? You too? Okay. So they had, Elisha was giving intelligence. He was able to know what Ben-Hadad was doing on raids and sending that intelligence to the king of Israel so that he could avoid destruction. And then Ben-Hadad goes and surrounds the city where Elisha is living, seeking to kill him. And that does not work out, okay? So now here's Ben-Hadad, and he is sick. He's reigned for about 40 years at this point. And it was told him that the man of God has come here. So he found out Elisha was in town. Excuse me. And the king said to Hazael, "Take a present with you and go and meet the man of God and inquire of the Lord through him, saying, 'Shall I recover from this sickness?'" Now, here you have, and this is a direct play, in my opinion, of what the author of Kings is doing. Hold on just a second. I'm going to fight this thing off. Go ahead. Okay. So, as this book opens, you remember we meet the son of Ahab who has fallen through the lattice, and he doesn't know if he's going to recover. And who does he send to find out if he will recover from his injuries? He sends to a foreign deity. And Elijah calls him on it and says, "Is there not a prophet in Israel that you can't trust?" Now here you have, in a contrast or a juxtaposition to that, you have a pagan king who is coming and seeking the counsel of the prophet of Israel when the kings of Israel won't even do that. And so, even though they've had a tumultuous relationship, certainly, there is a play being made here by the writer of Kings showing that the Gentile kings are outshining the Jewish kings. It's very similar, as we've said before, to the book of Jonah. Whenever you see in Jonah, he has a lot of interactions with Gentiles. And so whenever he interacts with Gentiles, the Gentiles always outshine him in morality and in goodness and in faithfulness. And so it's meant to cast shame upon him for the way he was behaving. All right? So verse 9, Hazael went to meet him and took a present with him, all kinds of goods of Damascus, 40 camels' loads, quite a significant amount. When he came and stood before him, he said, "Your son Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, has sent me to you, saying, 'Shall I recover from this sickness?' Elisha said to him, 'Go say to him, you shall certainly recover, but the Lord has shown me that he shall certainly die.'" What's he saying? He's going to recover. Like, it's not, he's going to die. That's the overall message. He's going to die. But it's not going to be the sickness. Am I going to recover from the sickness? Sure, it's not going to be the sickness that kills you. But you're going to die in the process. Okay? So in verse 11, it says, "He fixed his gaze and stared at him until he was embarrassed. And the man of God wept." Okay, so when you're reading this in English, it's kind of hard to say who is looking at who. Okay? But in the original, it's pretty clear that this is Hazael staring at Elisha. Okay? So Hazael is staring at Elisha, and he's just frozen. And then Elisha begins to weep. Now, Hazael is frozen, and I'm going to submit to you what we'll see in just a minute, that Hazael is frozen out of fear, because Hazael is caught. Okay? The man of God knows what he's going to do. But we'll get to that here in just a minute when we see how he responds to Ben-Hadad. So here he is as he's weeping, and Elisha's weeping in verse 11. In verse 12, Hazael said, "Why does my Lord weep?" He answered, "Because I know the evil that you will do to the people of Israel. You will set on fire their fortresses, and you will kill their young women with the sword, and dash in pieces their little ones, and rip open their pregnant women." So he's saying, you're going to do all this to Israel. What's the implication then if he's the one responsible for it? He's the king. If he's the one that's going to lead it, he's going to be responsible for it. He's the king. So there is the first indication. Now, listen to what he says, the details of this. "I know the evil that you will do to Israel." And we read of his evil a little bit in chapter 8. We see it in chapters 9, 10, 12, and 13. He reigns about 40 plus years, and he continuously creates problems for Israel. And notice what he says You'll set on fire their fortresses, that is, you'll burn their stronghold cities. You'll kill their young men with the sword in battle and dash in pieces their little ones. This had to do with the common custom that they would either, especially in fortresses where you had city walls, they would take young children and basically go up to the top and just pitch them off the wall down into a ravine. Or they would take them and basically take their head and say, this is a wall. They would take their head and just do that until they killed the child. And they would do even worse, because then he says what? Dash in pieces their little ones and rip open their pregnant women. That was actually pretty common. It's a little bit more graphic than even that. Not only would they rip them open, they would use the umbilical cord to tie the child around the mother's neck that was dead, and the mother had to walk with it. And by the way, this is not the only time this is mentioned. The Assyrians especially were cruel. I mean, they were cruel. And the Assyrians will be the next nation that's going to give Israel problems, but they were, in Amos 1:13, Hosea 4:10, he's talking about the the Assyrian invasion that will come and take the 10 northern tribes into captivity, and he mentions the same type of thing again, of ripping open pregnant women and killing children in the process. So he's going to plunder them. And then Hazael responds in verse 13. Hazael said, what is your servant who is but a dog that he should do this great thing? Elisha answered, the Lord has shown me that you are to be king over Syria. And so he looks at it this is a personal opinion, I kind of get the sense that he's playing dumb. I think Hazael knows exactly what he's going to do. I think Hazael has it all planned out that he's going to kill Ben-Hadad and usurp the throne, basically. But he says, who am I and what is my father's house? I'm just a dog, a dead dog. For an example, Mephibosheth says this in 2 Samuel 9 when David offers him great kindness to eat at his table always and to restore in the lands. It's just a way of saying I'm nobody. Why would I could never be king. I'm nobody. I don't have the royal blood and the royal lineage. And Elisha responds and says, well, the Lord has shown me that you're going to be the king over Syria. Then he departed, verse 14, from Elisha and came to his master, who said to him, what did Elisha say to you? He said, he told me that you would certainly recover. Anything missing? He left out the part. Technically, yeah. That's the thing. That's the thing about technicalities. So he gives him part of the answer, and that kind of sets you up to the notion then to what happens next as he basically smothers him. Verse 15, it says, but the next day he took the bedcloth and dipped it in water and spread it over his face. Now, obviously, he does that on the guise of, first of all, Ben-Hadad doesn't think his closest advisor is going to kill him. And second of all, what would you use a nice, cold, wet washcloth for? I mean, with all the advancements in modern medicine, we still use those things, right? Somebody's got a temperature, we try and cool them off, refresh them a little bit. And so it's under the guise of that he just kind of spreads it over his face. Except he spread it over his face until he died. He smothers him with it. And Hazael became king in his place. And it was true when he said, I am no one, I'm not of royal lineage. That's true. We have inscriptions from Assyrian kings. I think Shalmaneser, an Assyrian king. Yep. He calls him basically the son of nobody. It's a slight at him, basically. Didn't believe he had divine right to sit in his position. But either way, so here's Hazael, and he becomes king of Syria. And Syria has been a major thorn in their side, basically all throughout kings after the reign of Solomon. So the enemies of Israel, when you look at them, in the days of Samuel and Saul and David, it was the Philistines that gave them problems all the time. Okay? Then it became the Syrians. Then it's going to become the Assyrians. And then it's going to become the Babylonians. Okay? So we're kind of watching the history of politics play out on a global scale. Okay. Now we're going to return at long last to kings of Judah. The last time we saw a king of Judah would have been in 1 Kings 15. From 1 Kings 15 and verse 25 all the way until now, we've done nothing but talk about Ahab and his sons who were reigning in Israel. Okay? So that tells you something, that a good chunk of this book has been focused on Ahab and a handful of his sons that are reigning as kings in Israel. Now, the reason why it does that is because Ahab was the king. You remember Jeroboam got him in trouble with calf worship. Well, back up. Solomon started introducing idolatry. Jeroboam introduced calf worship. And then Ahab and his home introduced Baal worship. And so they're progressively getting worse. Okay? They're progressively getting worse in their idolatries. And actually, the only reason we see kings of Judah right here is because the kings of Judah are going to start acting like the kings of Israel now. Which means they're going to do what? The exact opposite. They're going to go into idolatry. And so that's really the reason why, because now what has happened is Ahab is not only, he's dead by now, obviously. We've seen that in 1 Kings 22. But now that influence is going to spill over into the south because there's going to be an intermarriage between north and south, Ahab's family and the royal family of the south. And then Ahab's family is going to influence them to do terrible things in the process as well. So that's where we'll meet these kings of Judah then. Verse 16. This is Jehoram. He reigns from 848 to 841. And some of those years he's in a co-regency with his father. Okay. So in the 5th year of Joram, the son of Ahab, the king of Israel, when Jehoshaphat was king of Judah, Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, began to reign. Now notice what's being said there. So you have the king of Israel listed, and then you have Jehoshaphat as king of Judah. So you have Israel and Judah. So where is Jehoram reigning? That's why we call it a co-regency. He's reigning with his dad. They're splitting responsibilities, okay? And so he begins to reign in 848 as a co-regent with his father. And then in verse 17 it says he was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. Now, when you look at the Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 21, 1 through 4, when he was appointed king by his father, he then had all of his brothers executed. Okay? Again, that's going to become more and more common in this book. The family is executed. It was very common in secular kingdoms that you would execute your family members. Why? No threat to the throne. You have legitimacy. Nobody can stand in and take your place. And so anyway, being a royal wasn't all it was made out to be, especially in these days. It was basically a sentence to a very short life. Either way, if you became king or you didn't. So he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem, verse 18, and he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, as the house of Ahab had done, for the daughter of Ahab was his wife. So this lady, his wife, like her mother before her, influences her husband to do evil. The same way that Jezebel influenced Ahab to do evil. You remember it was said at the end of Ahab's life that there was no one that ever was stirred up the way that Ahab was by Jezebel, his wife, to do evil. She incited him to do evil. And I got to be honest with you, if that's not a lesson about pay attention to who you marry, I don't know what is. And it's really impossible to understand. It's impossible to understand. I think most married people would agree with this. You know that you're going to influence each other, but I think it's really impossible to ever fully estimate before you get into marriage how much influence you have on each other. It's like many things. You kind of got to experience it to realize its pull. And you see what is happening here. I mean, these two women are going to become linchpins, basically. They're going to be the ones that kind of bring these kingdoms down, both of them. I mean, they were already in trouble, but they kind of speed up the process. And so, at the end of verse 18, it says, "And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Yet the Lord was not willing to destroy Judah for the sake of David his servant, since he promised to give a lamp to him and to his sons forever." So he doesn't remove the king. Why not? We've seen it in Israel, right? They've changed dynasties, that's the term I use to describe it. That is, ruling families. It started out in Jeroboam's family, and then it was passed on to another family, and then another family took over. But that has not happened in Judah, and God says it will not happen. Now why? He made a promise to David. 2 Samuel 7, that there would always be one of his seed that was seated upon the throne in Israel, in Judah. And he even says this to Solomon when he sends, I think, Abijah or Ahijah. I always get those two confused. One of those, Abijah or Ahijah, 1 Kings 11, to tell Solomon that the kingdom is being taken away from him. And he's saying that the only reason the whole kingdom is not taken away is because of who your dad was. I had such respect and honor for him and the promise that I made to him that no matter how bad you get, I'm still going to keep my word to your father. It's very much, the emphasis there is very much on God's faithfulness to keep his word, but it also says something about David and the way that God held him in such high regard. That is, I think, an important thing for us to think on. So in verse 20, in his days, Edom revolted from the rule of Judah and set up a king of their own. Edom, these were descendants of Esau, lived southeast, basically, of Israel. Now, this is actually a pretty significant statement that they cast off Israelite control and set up their own king, because this relationship has really old origins, right? So there were two boys that were twins in Genesis. Who were they? Jacob and Esau. What was said of them, you remember, because their mother was very concerned because they were pretty rambunctious when they were in the womb, causing her a lot of difficulties. And she prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told her what? Right. So basically the answer was that there are two nations in your womb, and the older will serve the younger. Now, the problem, well, not really a problem, but it does seem to be a problem until you read on. Throughout the rest of Genesis is that the younger son never actually rules over the older son. Because it wasn't about them in particular, it was about their nations. Edom doesn't actually come under Israelite control until 2 Samuel 8 under David. Okay? So now they lose control of Edom. So what does that tell you that is happening to Israel, or to Judah in this particular case? what happens if you're in control of a nation and then you lose control of it? What's it symbolize? You're weak. You're losing power. You're losing land that you had before, especially in this context. You're losing land you had before when you were faithful to God, and now that you have become unfaithful, the kingdom is starting to reverse. Like it's not staying with you the way that it would have had you been faithful to God in this process. So verse 21, then Joram passed over to Zair or to Zoar, just south of the Dead Sea, with all his chariots, and rose by night, and he and his chariot commanders struck the Edomites who surrounded him, but his army fled home. So Edom revolted from the rule of Judah to this day. Then Libnah revolted at the same time. Okay, so he goes to try and put them back into subjection, and it just doesn't work. He gets beaten, then he runs, and then what happens? And there's another one. Libnah, on the Philistine border, starts revolting against him. By the way, international politics don't change. The reason why, all you got to do is look at history. You have to pay attention to just one, because just one is never where it's going to stop. It's never where it's going to stop. Ever. It's not the way it works. He lost one. The others thought, well, if they're weak enough and they're beat enough there, we can do it. And so it ends up becoming a domino effect for them. And again, this is, in our study, we're talking about the rise and the ruin of Israel. Their climb and their quick decline and coming down to basically nothing. And that's exactly what's happening right before our eyes. So in verse 23 it says, now the rest of the acts of Joram and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And Joram slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David, and Ahaziah his son reigned in his place. I want to read one statement about him from 2 Chronicles 21. He was 32 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem, and he departed with no one's regret. He departed with no one's regret. Nobody was upset to see him die. So, look, when people talk about the Old Testament and why it doesn't make any sense, or why should we study it? Why should we think on things? If a statement like that does not cause you to stop and just sit and think for a minute, the problem's not with the Old Testament. The problem's with us. To live my life and to cease to exist and nobody really care. How bad of a human being do you have to be? So now his son is going to take over. 25, in the 12th year of Joram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, began to reign. And Ahaziah was 22 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Athaliah, and she was the granddaughter of Omri, king of Israel. Now, Athaliah, his mother, Athaliah, is the woman who is mentioned in verse 18, for she was the daughter of Ahab, or the daughter of Ahab was his wife. Her name was Athaliah. Okay? It's the same person here, except now it's talking about, she's basically the mother of this king now. And people look at it and say, but it says Ahab, the daughter of Ahab, but here it says the granddaughter of Omri. Well, there's no inconsistency there. Who was Ahab's father? Omri. And so if Ahab is her father, then that would make Omri her grandfather. So there's no inconsistency in the statements. They're true. They're just saying it in two different ways. Okay? So it says, he also walked in the way of the house of Ahab and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the house of as the house of Ahab had done, for he was the son-in-law to the house of Ahab. He went with Joram, the son of Ahab, to make war against Hazael, king of Syria. So here's our guy who's been anointed, and he's starting to be a problem. And they made war at Ramoth Gilead. Now, it seems as if they probably went to war. Hazael didn't really start this war. It seems like the kings of Israel and Judah did. And most likely they did it to revenge what happened to Ahab in 1 Kings 22. Sound familiar? Trying to settle old scores in modern wars. But by the way, nations aren't the only people that do that kind of junk. People do it all the time. There are families that hate each other and they can't tell you why because it happened so long ago. They cannot tell you why. And so they're constantly back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Listen, what's going to happen is this, because when you get back and forth in relationships, you're always going to one up, right? The person hurts you, you have to escalate it one up. And then when they come back, they're going to escalate one up over you, and then they're one up over you, you're going to one up over them, and this process is going to keep climbing. At some point, you have to stop the merry-go-round of hate and hurt. And God shows us how to stop that hate and hurt. You forgive people. Forgiveness is about taking a blow from another person and refusing to retaliate. To simply take the blow, to take the cost, and to pay the price. Because at some point, if somebody doesn't step in and forgive the situation and move beyond the situation, we're just going to keep on this merry-go-round. That's all we're going to do. We're going to be mad at each other, and we're going to hate each other for generations and generations and generations, and none of us can even tell you why we hate each other. We just know you don't do business with that family because back in 1826, they had a deal that went wrong. Listen, I don't even know who my relative was in 1826. And you know what? He could have been a dishonest man. I don't know. But what's that got to do with me hating this other person's relative in 2022? That's at the heart of the gospel. What are we doing to God with our sin? We're raging against Him and raging against Him and raging against Him. At some point, though, God said, I want to end that cycle. And I'm willing to absorb the blow for what you have done in myself. That's the cross. I'm willing to absorb the blow. I'm willing to say, I'll take the penalty just so our relationship can get back to where it should be. So here they are trying to settle old scores. By the way, they're kings, and they're not thinking about the people that they're leading who are going to die to settle their old scores. Because when you go to settle old scores, let me tell you something. It ain't just you and the other person anymore. There will be other people who were hurt in your wake. So they go and war with the Syrians, and the Syrians wound Joram at the end of verse 28. In verse 29 it says, and King Joram returned to be healed in Jezreel. Jezreel was Ahab's winter palace. It's actually where he died, 1 Kings 22. And the wounds that the Syrians had given him at Ramah when he fought with Hazael, king of Syria. And Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, went down to see Joram, the son of Ahab, in Jezreel, because he was sick. And so there they are, communing and thinking together. We're going to see what happens to them probably in a couple of weeks when we get to chapter 9. But so here they are. Judah has become like Israel. And by the way, this is going to become a theme of the prophets. Okay? This is going to become a theme in the prophets. You're going to get to like Ezekiel 23, where he's going to talk about two sisters, Aholah and Aholibah. One stands for Israel, one stands for Judah. Israel's going to go into captivity first for their idolatry, and then Judah watches them go into captivity for their idolatry. They don't learn from their mistakes, and they end up going into captivity, becoming just like them. And God says that Judah is actually more culpable than Israel, because they saw it. They saw what happens when you go into idolatry. They saw the Assyrians come in and take the north, and they just kept plunging right ahead and doing whatever in the world they wanted to do. So God said, you're more culpable. Israel was the first to try. You got to see how it worked out, and you did it anyway. So, that is the end of that particular section. And this section has been about kings and prophets, or the kings versus the prophets, basically. Because the kings stopped being who they were supposed to be, God used prophets to call them back to who they were supposed to be. All right. Any questions or anything on it? All right, so I'll be here next week. We'll do the review and maybe get into chapter 9 some. And then the next week, I'll be out of town, and Pope Bobby will be in here teaching during that time period. Call him Pope, please. He does not like it. So I want you to call him Pope Bobby. It comes from the annual planning meeting. So anyway, we will pick up there, hopefully reviewing next week and then on into chapter 9.